Galen's teacher spewed straight bullshit about humans. Every Voxari in the Empire knew that, except Galen. The young gray-skinned Voxari tapped his long, scaly fingers on his desk, desperately wanting to argue as his teacher Zaltor blathered on. Humans are primitive and backward savages, was the message every class. The Voxari have watched them for centuries. They pose no threat to our empire in the slightest, Zaltor said, his voice droning in the dark classroom. Galen struggled not to fall asleep as three-dimensional diagrams of human technology floated next to Zaltor. Combustion engines, projectile firearms, and early nuclear power. Exactly the tech Voxar ancestors used millennia ago. Galen was much more interested in the one human DNA helix floating in the diagram. He wanted to know about human culture and biology, not human antiques which were useless in combat against modern tech. Suddenly, a shrill screech ripped through the classroom. For a second, Galen thought the diagrams of primitive humans had screamed, but it was actually an emergency hollow appearing next to the DNA helix. Galen thought Voxari skin color could not get paler, but Zaltor's skin blanched another shade of ash gray as he gaped wide-eyed at the hollow. An alien fleet of unrecognized black metal ships was emerging from a hyperspace rift at the edge of the Zephyria system. The alien fleet was larger than anything the Voxari had ever seen, but most terrifyingly, the ships were distinctly and unmistakably human in origin. If the humans really were as primitive as Galen was taught, how could their ships outclass everything in recorded Voxari history in both size and number? Most worrying, the humans' vessels appeared bristling with weaponry. Massive turrets and spinal-mounted mass drivers protruded from the hulls. In the center of the fleet was a gargantuan human flagship as large as a Voxari moon, its hull covered in arcane patterns. Its frontal hammerhead contained a weapon Galen had only ever seen theoretical models of in engineering class, a nickel Dyson beam, a weapon capable of destroying an entire planet. The Voxari may have monitored the humans for centuries, but it appears that during that time the humans may have become the most technologically powerful species in the entire galaxy. Mere minutes ago, Galen had believed humans to be savages barely capable of spaceflight. Now, before his very eyes glared proof that everything Galen and the entire Voxari civilization knew about humans was dead wrong. As the human war fleet burnt closer to Zephyria, Zaltor turned to the class with fear evident in his black eyes. He shouted at them to evacuate to the bunkers immediately. Galen's hearts raced as he realized that he and every single one of his classmates were now staring potential death in the face because of how drastically his species had underestimated the humans. The Voxari homeworld could be annihilated in a cosmic eye blink. Galen prayed to the ancestors that the humans would show more mercy to the Voxari than his people had ever planned to show them. Alarms blared and echoed off the metal walls of the dark corridor as Galen dashed through the evacuation tunnel with Zaltor and his classmates. They sprinted toward the massive fallout bunker buried deep beneath the surface of Zephyria. The shelter was a sprawling complex designed to protect the Voxari government and military leadership in the event of catastrophe. Zaltor panted as they ran. "This bunker will protect us from the humans." Galen's stomach turned as the reality of their situation sank in. The Voxari were under attack by humans. How could this be happening? Soldiers rushed by them, heading to battle stations. Galen overheard snatches of their frantic conversations. Humans destroyed the outpost in the Zephon system. Their ships are headed for Zephyria now. Been secretly building weapons for decades. Galen's blood ran cold. The humans hadn't just attacked Zephyria. Their war fleet had annihilated Voxari colonies across the sector. And this was no hasty strike. The humans had planned this war for years, constructing advanced ships and devastating weaponry, all while the Voxari assumed their species was technologically inferior. They finally reached the command center buried in the heart of the bunker complex. Through the viewport, Galen watched the space battle unfold in orbit over Zephyria. The Voxari fleet was massive, their numbers far greater than the human ships. But it didn't matter. The human vessels moved with impossible speed and grace, their hulls deflecting the Voxari torpedoes with ease. The human ships returned fire, unleashing a storm of plasma beams and graviton pulses. The blinding light of the explosions flashed across Galen's face as he watched the Voxari fleet being torn apart. Suddenly, the entire command center shook violently, consoles exploding in showers of sparks. Galen was hurled to the floor by the force of the blast. His vision swam as he pushed himself to his knees. Through the smoke he saw them, human soldiers in black exoskeletal armor storming into the room, the barrels of their pulse rifles burning red hot. They moved with brutal efficiency, gunning down the Voxari guards before they could even reach for their weapons. As quickly as it had begun, it was over. The human soldiers had seized control of the bunker. Galen looked around in stunned disbelief at the bodies of dead Voxari soldiers. His fellow students huddled together in terror. The humans had won. Galen and the others were now their captives, and the fate of the Voxari species hung by a thread. Galen knew that the true battle for survival was only just beginning. With the command center secure, Galen, Zaltor, and a group of high-ranking Voxari found themselves herded together under the watchful eyes of their human captors. The soldiers shoved them to their knees before a grizzled, battle-hardened man who carried himself with an air of authority. The human removed his helmet, revealing a weathered face etched with scars. "I'm Captain Ethan Mason," he said, his voice gruff. "Which one of you is in charge?" Zaltor remained silent, but one of the officials spoke up, his voice trembling. "I am Counselor Zoran, a member of the Voxari High Council." Mason's eyes narrowed. "I'll get right to the point. Where are your weapons caches and research facilities?" Zoran shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." Mason nodded to one of his soldiers, who pressed the barrel of his pulse rifle against Zoran's temple. "I'm not in the mood for games, Counselor. Tell me what I want to know, or things will get messy." Zoran's eyes darted frantically between the human soldier and his fellow Voxari, but he remained silent. Mason sighed and gave a curt nod. There was a blinding flash of light and a sizzling sound as the pulse rifle discharged, vaporizing Zoran's head in an instant. His body slumped to the floor, smoke rising from the charred stump of his neck. Galen felt bile rise in his throat as he stared at the remains of the counselor. The human soldier stepped back, his expression impassive, as if he had just swatted a fly. Mason turned his attention to Galen and Zaltor, his gaze cold and unforgiving. "Let that be a lesson to the rest of you. We will not hesitate to kill every last one of you if you don't cooperate." Galen found his voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Mason let out a harsh laugh. "You really don't know, do you? Your people contacted us years ago demanding that we submit to your rule. You thought you could bully us into surrendering our freedom, our way of life." He leaned in closer, his breath hot on Galen's face. "But you underestimated us. We didn't bow down to you. Instead, we started preparing for war. We built ships and weapons that you couldn't even imagine, and we trained our soldiers to fight against your kind." Galen's mind reeled as he processed Mason's words. The Voxari had always believed that they were superior to the humans, that their technology and intellect made them the natural rulers of the galaxy. But now, faced with the brutal reality of the humans' military might, Galen realized that they had been arrogant fools. Suddenly, the bunker shook violently as another explosion rocked the complex. Alarms began to blare, and red emergency lights flashed in the command center. Mason barked orders to his soldiers. "Prepare for a counterattack! The Voxari must have called in reinforcements. Get to your defensive positions now!" As the humans scrambled to take up positions around the room, Galen huddled closer to Zaltor and the other Voxari prisoners. The fate of their entire species hung in the balance, and Galen realized with a sinking feeling that they were now caught in the middle of a war that would determine the future of the galaxy itself. The command center erupted into chaos as Voxari reinforcements stormed into the bunker, their energy weapons flashing. Human soldiers dove for cover, returning fire with their pulse rifles. The air filled with the stench of ozone and scorched flesh. In the midst of the firefight, Mason's comm unit crackled to life. "Captain, this is Admiral Graves. The Voxari have launched a massive counterattack. Our ships are taking heavy losses. We need a new strategy. Fast." Mason ducked as a plasma bolt sizzled past his head. He knew he had to act quickly. "Rogers, take half the squad and hold off these Voxari bastards. Davis, you're with me. We're heading to the control room." He grabbed Galen by the arm, yanking him to his feet. "You're coming too, kid. You know this bunker better than anyone." Galen stumbled after Mason and Davis as they fought their way through the winding corridors, pulse rifles blazing. Voxari guards leapt out from every corner, their energy blades humming. The humans were outnumbered, but their superior tactics and weaponry evened the odds. Even so, they took casualties. Davis cried out as a plasma bolt seared through his armor, dropping him to one knee. Mason hauled him back to his feet, leaving a smear of blood on the metal floor. Galen's heart hammered in his chest as he watched the brutal close-quarters combat. The screams of the dying and the stench of burnt flesh overwhelmed his senses. He had never seen such violence, such merciless killing. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the control room. Mason shoved Galen towards the communications console. "Get me a link to the fleet now." Galen's fingers shook as he worked the controls, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to refuse, to deny this human invader access. But he knew it would mean his death, and likely the death of countless more Voxari. He had no choice. The console beeped as the connection went through. Mason leaned in, his voice urgent. "Admiral, I have critical intel on the Voxari battle strategy. Transmitting now." There was a pause, then Admiral Graves's voice crackled over the comm. "Copy that, Captain. Adjusting our formation now. We'll hit those Xeno bastards where they least expect it." Mason turned to Galen, his eyes hard. "Looks like you just helped us turn the tide of this war, kid. But don't think for a second that makes us friends." Galen swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He had betrayed his own people, even if it was under duress. He had played a role in their defeat. That knowledge weighed on him like a crushing gravity, even as the battle raged on around him. Mason's grip tightened on his pulse rifle as he surveyed the devastation in the command center. The acrid stench of burnt circuitry and charred flesh hung heavy in the air. He turned to his soldiers, barking orders. "Secure the bunker, search every room. I want any intel you can find, maps, comm logs, anything that can give us an edge." As the soldiers fanned out, Mason grabbed Galen by the shoulder. "You're with me, kid. We're going topside." Galen's hearts raced as he followed Mason and a small team of soldiers into the elevator. The metal doors slid open, revealing a scene of utter destruction. Galen stepped out onto the rubble-strewn streets of Zephyria, barely recognizing his once beautiful home. Skyscrapers that had stood for centuries now lay in crumbled heaps, their metal frames twisted and scorched. Fires raged out of control, belching thick black smoke into the sky. The distant sounds of explosions and energy weapons fire echoed through the ruined city. Mason led the team through the debris-choked streets, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. Galen struggled to keep pace, his mind reeling from the shock of seeing his world reduced to ashes. After what felt like hours of navigating the ruined cityscape, they arrived at the heavily fortified walls of a Voxari military compound. Mason turned to Galen, his expression grim. "This is it, the Voxari High Command. If we're going to end this war, we need to take them down." Galen swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He knew this compound, had visited it many times with his father. He also knew the kind of security measures they would be facing. "I can get us inside," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "But it won't be easy." Using Galen's knowledge of the Voxari security protocols, they managed to slip past the outer defenses and infiltrate the compound. They moved silently through the corridors, the only sound the faint hum of Mason's pulse rifle. They burst into the central command room, weapons drawn. Inside, a group of high-ranking Voxari military leaders stood around a holographic display table. Among them, Galen recognized the tall, imposing figure of his father, General Zoran. Mason leveled his rifle at the Voxari, his voice cold. "It's over. Surrender now, and we can end this without any more bloodshed. General Zoran looked up, his black eyes blazing with defiance. We will never submit to human rule, he spat. The Voxari are the rightful rulers of this galaxy. As Mason and Zoran argued, Galen's eyes were drawn to the holographic display. His blood ran cold as he realized what he was seeing. It was a schematic for a weapon, a device of unimaginable destructive power. Father, what is this? Galen asked, his voice trembling. Zoran turned to his son, a cruel smile playing across his lips. Our salvation, he said. A weapon that will ensure the Voxari's dominance over the galaxy forever. He tapped a control on the display, bringing up a star map. A red line traced a path from Zephyria to a small blue planet on the outer rim, Earth. The weapon is already on its way to the human homeworld, Zoran said, his voice filled with triumph. Within hours, Earth will be nothing but a smoldering ruin, and the humans will be wiped from existence. Mason's face paled as he realized the implications of Zoran's words. He turned to Galen, desperation in his eyes. We need to stop that weapon. You're the only one who can help us. Please. Galen looked from his father to Mason, torn between his loyalty to his people and the horror of what they had done. In the end, he knew there was only one choice he could make. I'll help you, he said, his voice steady. But we need to hurry. The weapon's control codes are in the compound's main computer core. We need to get there before it's too late. Mason nodded grimly, then turned to his soldiers. Engage the Voxari forces, he ordered. Buy us as much time as you can. As pulse rifles and energy weapons clashed in a fierce battle around them, Galen and Mason raced deeper into the compound, both knowing that the fate of billions hung in the balance. Galen's fingers flew across the control console, lines of code flashing by on the screen. The command center shook as explosions echoed outside, the battle between the humans and Voxari intensifying with each passing second. Mason and his soldiers held the line, pulse rifles blazing as they cut down wave after wave of Voxari attackers. Sweat beaded on Galen's brow as he dug deeper into the computer system, searching for the weapon's deactivation sequence. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts, loyalty to his species warring with the undeniable truth that the Voxari's actions were wrong. The humans didn't deserve annihilation. There had to be another way. Traitor! His father's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Galen spun to face him, the older Voxari's eyes burning with rage. You would betray your own kind? For what? These savages? Galen shook his head, desperate to make his father understand. This war is based on a lie. We were wrong about the humans. There's still a chance for peace if we just... His father drew his energy pistol in a flash, aiming it squarely at Galen's chest. Peace? With them? Never. I will not allow you to destroy everything our people have built. Galen braced himself for the shot, but it never came. Mason stepped between them, his own weapon leveled at the Voxari general. Stand down, the human captain ordered, his voice like steel. Killing your own son won't solve anything. You know nothing of our ways, human, Galen's father spat. I know that destroying Earth will only breed more hatred, Mason countered. More violence. Is that what you want? An endless cycle of revenge? For a moment, Galen saw a flicker of doubt in his father's eyes, a moment of hesitation, the weight of the decision hanging in the balance. Then the world exploded. The command center doors blew inward, a squad of Voxari soldiers pouring through, energy weapons spitting deadly bolts of plasma. Mason's team responded instantly, diving for cover and returning fire. In the midst of the firefight, Galen saw his father stagger, a stray bolt catching him in the chest. Time seemed to slow as the older Voxari fell, his pistol clattering to the floor. Galen scrambled to his side, cradling his father's head in his lap. The general's breath came in ragged gasps, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. Galen, he whispered, his voice faint. You were right. About everything. I was blinded by my own hatred. With a trembling hand, he pressed a data chip into Galen's palm. The codes for the weapon. You must stop it. Tears streamed down Galen's face as he watched the light fade from his father's eyes. He clutched the data chip like a lifeline, the weight of his father's final words settling on his shoulders. Mason appeared at his side, his face grim. We need those codes, Galen. With shaking hands, Galen slotted the chip into the console, the deactivation sequence scrolling across the screen. He input the codes, his finger hovering over the final key. A part of him hesitated, the loyalty to his species still tugging at his heart. But he knew what he had to do, for the sake of both their peoples, for the chance of a future beyond this war. He pressed the button, the words, "Weapon deactivated," flashing green. Galen slumped back in the chair, a mix of relief and grief washing over him. He had stopped the weapon, but at what cost? His father was dead, his people's fate uncertain. Mason's hand gripped his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. You did the right thing, kid. Your father would be proud. As the battle continued to rage around them, Galen knew that this was only the beginning. The road to peace would be long and bloody, the scars of this war not easily healed. But for now, Earth was safe, and perhaps, with time and understanding, their two species could find a way forward together. Mason hefted his pulse rifle, his eyes scanning the ruined command center. The acrid stench of burnt plastic and scorched metal hung in the air. Sparks crackled from shattered consoles, casting an eerie glow across the carnage. Move out, Mason barked, motioning for his team to follow. Galen, you stay close to me. Galen nodded, his face a mix of shock and determination. He stepped over the bodies of fallen Voxari soldiers, their lifeless eyes staring up at him accusingly. Each step echoed the weight of his betrayal. They fought their way through the winding corridors, pulse rifles spitting deadly bolts of energy at any Voxari resistance they encountered. Galen flinched at each shot, the reality of the war he had been thrust into sinking in with every passing moment. Finally, they reached the bunker. The human soldiers had secured the facility, setting up a perimeter and treating their wounded. Mason strode up to the comm station, punching in the codes to contact the fleet. Admiral, this is Captain Mason. The bunker is secure and we have critical intelligence, requesting immediate extraction. As they waited for the dropships, Galen slumped against a wall, his mind reeling. The image of his father's lifeless body, the revelation of the Voxari's planet-destroying weapon, the brutality of the human soldiers, it all swirled together in a dizzying maelstrom of confusion and grief. He had been so wrong about everything, the Voxari's arrogance, the humans' resolve, the true nature of the conflict. It was all so much more complex than he had ever imagined. A sudden burst of plasma fire jolted Galen from his thoughts. A Voxari soldier, hidden in the shadows of the bunker, had opened fire on the humans. Mason and his team reacted instantly, diving for cover and returning fire. The bunker echoed with the deafening roar of pulse rifles and the sizzle of plasma bolts. The Voxari soldier lobbed a grenade, the small sphere arcing through the air with deadly intent. It detonated with a blinding flash and a thunderous boom, the shockwave slamming into Galen like a hammer blow. The world spun as Galen was hurled through the air, his body crashing into a pile of rubble. Pain lanced through his legs, a sickening crunch telling him that something was very wrong. He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. They were trapped beneath a heavy slab of metal, crushed and mangled. Galen cried out in agony, his voice raw and desperate. Through the haze of pain, he saw Mason's face appear above him. The human captain's eyes widened as he took in the extent of Galen's injuries. "We've got to get him out of here," Mason shouted to his soldiers. "I'm not leaving him behind." They dug frantically through the rubble, their hands bleeding as they tore at the jagged metal. Finally, they managed to lift the slab off Galen's legs, revealing the horrific damage beneath. Mason scooped Galen up in his arms, carrying him like a child. Galen gritted his teeth against the agony, his vision swimming as they made their way to the extraction point. The dropships were waiting, their engines roaring to life as Mason and his team approached. They clambered aboard, Galen's broken body cradled in Mason's arms. As they lifted off, Galen looked back at the ruined cityscape of Zephyria. The once proud towers lay in crumbled heaps, the streets choked with debris and the bodies of the fallen. Tears streamed down Galen's face as he watched his homeworld recede into the distance. Everything he had ever known, everything he had ever believed in, was gone, shattered like the bones in his legs. He knew that his life would never be the same again. The war had changed everything, for both the Voxari and the humans, and Galen had played a pivotal role in it all. The pain in his legs pulsed with each beat of his heart, a constant reminder of the price he had paid. But even through the agony, Galen knew that he had made the right choice. He had chosen to stand against the darkness, to fight for a future where humans and Voxari could coexist in peace. It was a future he might never see, but it was one he was willing to sacrifice everything for. The dropship shuddered as it docked with the human flagship, a behemoth of steel bristling with enough firepower to level a continent. Galen, barely conscious, was rushed out on a stretcher by a team of medics. They sprinted down the corridors, dodging groups of armed soldiers hurrying to battle stations. In the medical bay, doctors swarmed around Galen, cutting away his charred uniform, attaching tubes and sensors to his battered body. Machines beeped and hummed, fighting to keep him alive. Through the haze of pain, Galen saw Mason standing in the doorway. The captain's face was etched with concern, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't move, his eyes locked on Galen as if his sheer will could keep the young Voxari from slipping away. Time blurred, pain ebbing and flowing like a tide. Galen drifted, catching snippets of urgent conversation. So still pockets of resistance on Zephyria? Need to strike now before they regroup. This could turn the tide of the war. He forced his eyes open, his voice a ragged whisper. Captain Mason. Mason was at his side in an instant, leaning close. Easy, kid. You're safe now. Galen shook his head, wincing at the effort. The war, it's not over. Don't worry about that now. Just focus on getting better. No. Galen grabbed Mason's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. There's something you need to know. He told Mason about the secret research facility, the biological weapon that could change everything. Mason listened intently, his expression grim. I need to go with you, Galen said, struggling to sit up. I'm the only one who can get you inside. Mason hesitated, glancing at the doctors. They shook their heads, their faces grave. Absolutely not, one of them said. He's in no condition to go anywhere. But Galen was insistent. Please, Captain, I have to do this, for both our peoples. Mason sighed, then nodded slowly. All right, kid, but we're doing this my way. Hours later, Galen stood in the flagship's armory, encased in a sleek exoskeleton. The device whirred and clicked as it moved, supporting his weight, augmenting his strength. It was a marvel of human engineering, designed to keep wounded soldiers in the fight. He joined Mason and the strike team, a group of hardened veterans armed to the teeth. They looked at him with a mix of respect and wariness, unsure what to make of this alien ally. Mason clapped him on the shoulder, his expression serious. You sure you're up for this? Galen nodded, determination burning in his eyes. I'm ready, Captain. Let's end this war. As the strike team boarded their dropship, Galen couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose, of destiny. He had been a part of starting this conflict, however unintentionally. Now, he would be a part of ending it. The engines roared to life, the ship lifting off from the hangar bay. Galen stared out the viewport at the stars, at the distant shape of the moon where the Voxari facility waited. He knew the battle ahead would be fierce, that there was no guarantee of success. But he also knew that he would fight with everything he had, not just for the humans, but for the future of both their species. The dropship accelerated, hurtling through the void towards its target, towards the final confrontation that would decide the fate of the galaxy. The dropship's engines whined as it descended toward the moon's craterous surface. Galen gripped his pulse rifle tightly, his exoskeleton whirring softly with each movement. Mason stood beside him, his face grim and determined behind the visor of his helmet. The ship touched down with a jolt, the ramp lowering to reveal a barren, rocky landscape bathed in the eerie glow of the gas giant Zephyria looming on the horizon. "Move out!" Mason ordered, and the strike team surged forward, boots crunching on the gravelly ground. As they approached the research facility, a hail of plasma fire erupted from the fortified entrance. Crimson bolts sizzled through the air, scorching the rocks around them. The human soldiers reacted instantly, diving for cover and returning fire with their own weapons. Blue pulses of energy streaked towards the Voxari positions, the air crackling with the discharge. Galen ducked behind a boulder, his exoskeleton enhancing his strength and speed as he picked off Voxari guards with precise shots. His knowledge of their tactics and weak points proved invaluable as he guided the humans through the chaos. "Flank left!" he shouted over the din of battle. "Their armor is weakest at the joints." Mason nodded, signaling to his soldiers. They moved as one, a well-oiled machine of death and fury. Slowly, methodically, they pushed forward, the Voxari defenses crumbling under their relentless assault. They breached the entrance, the heavy blast doors groaning as they were forced open. Inside, the corridors were a maze of gleaming metal and pulsing conduits. Galen took point, his familiarity with Voxari architecture guiding them through the labyrinthine passages. His exoskeleton-enhanced fingers flew over control panels, overriding security protocols and sealing doors behind them. But as they neared the central research lab, they found their path blocked by a towering figure clad in midnight black armor. A horde of elite Voxari soldiers flanked the massive warrior, their weapons trained on the humans. The warrior's faceplate retracted, revealing a nightmare of genetic engineering. Its face was a twisted mass of scars and cybernetic implants, its eyes burning with an unnatural fire. It drew a crackling energy blade from its back, the weapon humming with barely restrained power. "Foolish humans," it growled, its voice a guttural rumble. "You dare to challenge the might of the Voxari Empire?" Mason stepped forward, his own plasma blade igniting in a blaze of blue fire. "We're here to end your twisted experiments once and for all," he spat. "Your reign of terror ends today." The warrior lunged, its blade slashing through the air with blinding speed. Mason parried, the clash of energy sending sparks flying. Around them, the battle erupted anew as the Voxari soldiers engaged the rest of the strike team. Plasma bolts and pulse blasts crisscrossed the corridor, the air thick with the stench of ozone and burning flesh. Galen leapt into the fray, his exoskeleton granting him speed and agility far beyond that of a normal Voxari. He danced among the elite soldiers, his pulse rifle spitting death with each squeeze of the trigger. But even with his enhanced abilities, the sheer number of Voxari began to overwhelm him. He heard Mason cry out in pain, saw the human captain stagger under a brutal blow from the warrior's energy blade. Galen disengaged from his own opponents, leaping to Mason's aid. He ducked under a sweeping slash of the warrior's blade, the searing heat of the weapon singeing his skin. He lashed out with a powered kick, his exoskeleton-enhanced strength sending the warrior stumbling back. Mason seized the opening, his plasma blade plunging into the warrior's chest. With a gurgling roar, the genetically engineered monstrosity collapsed, its life fading from its unnatural eyes. Galen helped Mason to his feet, the human captain nodding his thanks. Together, they led the charge into the research lab, pulse rifles at the ready. But as they burst into the cavernous chamber, they found it nearly empty. The Voxari scientists had already fled, taking their horrific biological weapon with them. Galen's eyes widened as he spotted a familiar figure among the few remaining scientists. Dr. Zahn, his old mentor, stood at a control console, his fingers flying over the keys. "Dr. Zahn," Galen shouted, his voice echoing in the empty lab. "What have you done?" Galen strode toward Dr. Zahn, his exoskeleton whirring with each step. The older Voxari's eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed. "What is this weapon, Dr. Zahn?" Galen demanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous lab. "What have you done?" Dr. Zahn's lips curled into a sneer. You always were a brilliant student, Galen, but you never understood the true potential of our work. He tapped a command into the console, and a holographic display sprang to life. Galen stared in horror at the schematics that rotated before him. It wasn't a virus or a bacteria, but something far more insidious. Nanites, Dr. Zahn said, his voice filled with pride. Microscopic machines designed to target specific genetic sequences, human DNA. Galen's blood ran cold. You're going to rewrite their genetic code? Wipe out their entire species? It's the perfect weapon, clean, efficient, and virtually unstoppable. Galen shook his head, his mind reeling. He had to stop this, had to make Dr. Zahn see reason. This is madness, Dr. Zahn. Genocide on a galactic scale. Please, it's not too late to stop this. Dr. Zahn's face hardened. Stop? Why would I stop when we are so close to victory? The humans are a threat, Galen. They always have been. This is the only way to ensure our survival. Galen argued back, desperation creeping into his voice. There's another way. Coexistence. Peace. The war is over, Dr. Zahn. The killing can stop. But Dr. Zahn was unmoved. His hand slammed down on the console, activating a hidden security protocol. Alarms blared, red lights flashing. Blast doors began slamming shut, sealing off the lab. Mason and his soldiers reacted instantly, firing at the closing doors. Pulse rounds ricocheted off the reinforced metal as they fought to reach Dr. Zahn and the nanite swarm. Galen leapt forward, his exoskeleton-enhanced strength straining as he caught a blast door, holding it open with inches to spare. Go! He shouted to Mason. I can't hold it for long! The human soldiers poured through the gap, Mason giving Galen a nod of thanks as he passed. They sprinted towards the central chamber, weapons at the ready. Dr. Zahn stood before a massive containment unit, his hand hovering over the release mechanism. You're too late, he said, a manic grin spreading across his face. The swarm is ready, and humanity's days are numbered. His hand came down and the unit hissed open. A cloud of shimmering silver nanites poured out, swarming through the air like a living mist. Galen didn't hesitate. He charged forward, leaping into the heart of the swarm. His exoskeleton's shielding flared, protecting him from the nanites' probing tendrils. He could see the control module, a glowing sphere at the center of the swarm. With a roar of effort, Galen plunged his hand into the mass of nanites, his fingers closing around the module. Energy surged through his arm, the feedback from the module's destruction ripping through his nerves. But as the pain overtook him, Galen saw the nanites falling like silver rain, their purpose erased, the weapon rendered inert. He collapsed to the floor, his exoskeleton smoking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Mason was at his side in an instant, helping him to his feet. You did it, kid, the human captain said, his voice filled with awe. You saved us all. Galen looked around the lab at the fallen nanites, at the stunned face of Dr. Zahn. The war was over, but the true battle, the battle for peace, for understanding, was just beginning. With the nanite swarm neutralized, Mason and his soldiers turned their pulse rifles on the fortified control room where Dr. Zahn had barricaded himself. They unleashed a hail of searing blue bolts at the heavy blast door, but the reinforced metal held strong, absorbing the impacts with dull thuds. Galen limped forward, his exoskeleton whirring. Wait, he called out, his voice ragged. I have an idea. He hobbled to a nearby computer terminal, his fingers dancing across the holographic keys. His eyes scanned the scrolling lines of code, searching for a vulnerability, a chink in Dr. Zahn's defenses. And there it was, an experimental energy shield designed to contain and study the nanite swarm. With a few quick commands, Galen hacked into the shield's control systems and activated it, directing the shimmering force field to envelop the control room in a bubble of crackling energy. Inside the room, Dr. Zahn's eyes widened as he realized he was trapped. His face contorted into a mask of rage, spittle flying from his lips as he slammed his fists against the shield. You fools, he screamed, his voice distorted by the energy field. The Voxari are the superior race. We will crush you like the insects you are. Galen stepped forward, his face inches from the shimmering barrier. No, Dr. Zahn. It is you who have been fooled. The Voxari's arrogance has blinded you to the truth. He gestured to Mason and the human soldiers. Look at them. They are not weak. They are resourceful, determined, and brave. They have fought against impossible odds and emerged victorious. Dr. Zahn sneered, his eyes burning with hatred. Victorious? They are nothing but savages, unworthy of the technology they wield. As Galen argued with his former mentor, Mason's keen eye spotted a flicker in the energy shield, a brief moment of instability. He signaled to his soldiers, directing their fire to that single point. Pulse bolts slammed into the weakened section of the shield, the concentrated energy causing the force field to flicker and fail. Dr. Zahn, seeing his chance, lunged for the control room's exit, his lab coat billowing behind him. But Galen was faster. Ignoring the pain lancing through his battered body, he tackled Dr. Zahn to the ground, the two Voxari scientists tumbling in a tangle of limbs. They grappled on the floor, trading blows with a ferocity born of desperation. Dr. Zahn clawed at Galen's face, his nails drawing blood. Galen retaliated with a solid punch to the jaw, the exoskeleton's enhanced strength sending Dr. Zahn reeling. The fight was brutal, but brief. Despite his injuries, Galen's youth and augmented strength proved too much for the older scientist. With a final crushing blow, Galen knocked Dr. Zahn unconscious, the Voxari's body going limp beneath him. Panting, Galen staggered to his feet. Dr. Zahn's unconscious form sprawled at his feet. Mason and his soldiers moved in, securing the scientist with restraints. Galen looked down at his former mentor, a mix of pity and anger swirling in his chest. Dr. Zahn had been so consumed by his own superiority, so blinded by the Voxari's propaganda, that he had been willing to commit genocide. But now, as Mason hauled the unconscious scientist to his feet, Galen knew that the tide had turned. With Dr. Zahn in custody and the nanite weapon destroyed, the humans had struck a critical blow against the Voxari war machine. The battle was far from over, but for the first time Galen allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, with the help of the humans, the cycle of hatred and violence that had consumed their two species could finally be broken. As the strike team's dropship docked with the human flagship, the hangar bay pressurized with a hiss. The ramp lowered, revealing the battered but victorious soldiers, with Dr. Zahn in restraints between them. Galen limped down the ramp, his exoskeleton whirring with each step. Pain lanced through his body, but he refused to let it show. Admiral Sinclair strode forward, his grizzled face etched with both relief and concern. He clasped Mason's hand, giving it a firm shake. Damn fine work, Captain. You and your team have struck a major blow against the Voxari. Mason nodded, his expression grim. Thank you, Admiral. But as you said, the war is far from over. Sinclair's face hardened. You're right. Our intel suggests the Voxari have launched a massive counterattack. They're targeting our colonies and outposts across the sector. Galen stepped forward, his voice hoarse. Admiral, I want to help. I have knowledge of Voxari technology, their tactics, and with Dr. Zahn in custody, I may be able to extract more information. Sinclair appraised Galen, his eyes searching. After a long moment, he nodded. Very well. We could use your expertise, Galen. Consider yourself a strategic advisor to the human fleet. Over the next several days, as the human fleet prepared for their next engagement, Galen pored over Voxari battle plans and intelligence reports. His eyes strained from staring at holographic displays, his mind racing to find weaknesses, exploitable patterns. And then he saw it, a network of hidden Voxari supply bases scattered throughout the sector. They were resupplying Voxari ships and troops, allowing them to strike deep into human territory without fear of running out of resources. Galen brought his findings to Admiral Sinclair and Captain Mason. Sinclair's eyes narrowed as he studied the holographic star map, the supply bases glowing red. If we can destroy these bases, Galen said, we can cripple the Voxari's ability to wage war. Sinclair nodded. Agreed. Captain Mason, assemble a strike team. Galen will accompany you, provide tactical support and intel. The raids began immediately. Galen, Mason, and a hand-picked team of elite soldiers struck at the Voxari supply bases, one by one. They infiltrated the base's defenses, Galen's knowledge of Voxari systems proving invaluable. But the missions were far from easy. At each base, they faced heavy resistance from Voxari forces. Plasma bolts filled the air, the acrid stench of melted metal and burnt flesh choking their lungs. Galen fought alongside the human soldiers, his exoskeleton enhancing his strength and speed. He ducked and weaved through the chaos of battle, his pulse rifle spitting deadly bolts of energy. On one particularly brutal raid, Galen found himself face-to-face with a Voxari commander, his former comrade. The commander's eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed in rage. "Traitor!" he spat, his energy blade humming to life. "You betray your own kind." Galen shook his head, his voice steady. "No, I fight for peace, for an end to this madness." Their blades clashed in a flurry of sparks, the air crackling with energy. Galen parried and thrust, his exoskeleton straining against the Voxari's enhanced strength. In the end, it was Galen who emerged victorious, his blade finding a gap in the commander's armor. The Voxari slumped to the ground, his eyes glazing over. Galen stood over him, his chest heaving, a mix of exhaustion and sorrow washing over him. But there was no time to dwell on it. The mission had to continue. And so they pushed on, through raid after grueling raid. They sabotaged Voxari equipment, destroyed stockpiles of weapons and supplies. Slowly but surely, they chipped away at the Voxari's ability to wage war. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it was a start, a glimmer of hope in the darkness of the war. And for Galen, it was a chance to make a difference, to help end the conflict that had consumed his people for so long. As the raids on the Voxari supply bases continued, a distress signal suddenly cut through the chatter on the human fleet's comm channels. It was a plea for help, coming from a Voxari colony on the planet Zephyr Prime. Galen's eyes widened as he listened to the message. The colony, it seemed, had been secretly supporting a rebel faction against the Voxari Empire. And now they were under attack by a Voxari fleet, led by none other than Admiral Krath. Galen had heard of Krath. The warlord was notorious for his brutality, his cunning, and his utter lack of mercy. If the rebels on Zephyr Prime were to have any chance of survival, they would need help. And fast. He turned to Admiral Sinclair, his voice urgent. "Admiral, we have to send aid to Zephyr Prime. The rebels there could be valuable allies. And if we let Krath wipe them out, it'll be a blow to the resistance movement across the entire sector." Sinclair frowned, weighing the options. Sending a task force to Zephyr Prime would mean diverting resources from the ongoing campaign against the Voxari. But Galen's argument was convincing. "Very well," Sinclair said at last. "Captain Mason, assemble your team. Galen will accompany you, along with a contingent of our best soldiers. Your mission is to make contact with these rebels and provide whatever assistance you can." Mason nodded, already moving to gather his gear. "Yes, sir." Hours later, their dropships touched down on the surface of Zephyr Prime, amidst the smoking ruins of what had once been a thriving Voxari settlement. The air was thick with the stench of burnt metal and charred flesh. Galen, his exoskeleton whirring softly, led Mason and the human soldiers through the rubble-strewn streets. The sounds of distant explosions and energy weapons fire echoed from the city's outskirts. As they neared the coordinates provided by the distress signal, a group of Voxari emerged from the shadows. They were battered and bloodied, their armor scorched and dented, but their eyes burned with a fierce determination. One of them, a tall, wiry Voxari with a jagged scar running down his face, stepped forward. "I am Raza," he said, his voice rough. "Leader of the Zephyr Prime Resistance. You must be the human reinforcements we requested." Mason nodded. "Captain Ethan Mason, at your service. This is Galen, our Voxari ally. He's the one who convinced our admiral to send aid." Raza's eyes widened as he took in Galen's exoskeleton, the human weaponry integrated into its frame. "You fight alongside the humans?" he asked, his tone a mix of surprise and respect. Galen met his gaze steadily. "I fight for peace, for an end to the Empire's tyranny, same as you." Raza grunted, then gestured for them to follow. "Come, we have much to discuss." As they made their way into the rebel hideout, Raza briefed them on the situation. Admiral Krath, it seemed, had been systematically wiping out rebel strongholds across Zephyr Prime, and he was doing it with a terrifying new weapon. "It's like nothing we've ever seen," Raza said, his voice grim. "It can level an entire city in a single blast. We don't know how he got his hands on such technology, but if we don't find a way to stop him, the resistance on Zephyr Prime is doomed." Galen and Mason exchanged a look. They had both seen their fair share of devastating weapons in this war, but something capable of such wholesale destruction. It was a game changer. "We need to get our hands on that weapon," Mason said, his jaw set. "Turn it against Krath and his fleet." Galen nodded. "Agreed. If we can board his flagship, I might be able to hack into the weapon's control systems, but it won't be easy." Raza leaned forward, his scarred face cast in the dim light of the hideout. "Nothing worth doing ever is, but with your help, we might just have a chance." And so, a plan was formed. Raza and his rebels would stage a diversion, drawing Krath's forces into a pitched battle on the planet's surface. Meanwhile, Galen, Mason, and a hand-picked team of human soldiers would infiltrate the Admiral's flagship and seize control of the weapon. It was a desperate gambit, but it was the only chance they had. As the rebel forces clashed with the Voxari ground troops, the sounds of battle rising from the ruined cityscape, Galen and the infiltration team made their move. They boarded a small, stealthy shuttle and rocketed towards Krath's flagship, a massive dagger-shaped vessel bristling with weapons and sensor arrays. Using Galen's knowledge of Voxari security protocols, they managed to slip through the ship's defenses and dock in a remote hangar bay. The moment they set foot on the flagship's deck, alarms began to blare. Krath knew they were coming. Voxari soldiers and battle droids swarmed towards them, plasma rifles spitting deadly bolts of energy. Galen and the human soldiers fought back with a ferocity born of desperation, their pulse weapons cutting through the enemy ranks like scythes through wheat. They pushed deeper into the ship, Galen's exoskeleton allowing him to move with a speed and strength that belied his injuries. Mason was a force of nature at his side, his plasma rifle blazing as he cut a path through the Voxari defenders. Deck by deck, corridor by corridor, they battled their way towards the heart of the ship, towards the weapon that could spell doom for the rebellion and for countless innocent lives. Finally, they reached the control room. Galen, his fingers flying over the console, hacked into the weapon's systems, disabling its safeguards and overriding its targeting protocols. But as the weapon began to charge, its energy levels rising to a crescendo, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Krath himself, a towering Voxari warrior, his body a nightmarish fusion of flesh and machine. "You dare to defy me?" he roared, his voice a metallic growl. "You dare to stand against the might of the Voxari Empire?" Galen and Mason stood their ground, weapons raised. They knew this would be the fight of their lives. Krath lunged, his cybernetic enhancements giving him speed and strength far beyond that of a normal Voxari. His energy blade, a crackling lance of pure destructive power, slashed through the air, nearly taking Mason's head from his shoulders. But Galen and the human captain fought as one, their movements synchronized, their attacks coordinated. They danced around Krath's furious onslaught, striking at his weaknesses, chipping away at his defenses. It was a battle that seemed to stretch for an eternity, a clash of wills and weapons, of flesh and metal. But in the end, it was Galen and Mason who emerged victorious. With a final desperate thrust of his plasma blade, Mason found a chink in Krath's armor, the superheated edge plunging into the warlord's chest. Krath staggered, his cybernetic limbs spasming, his eyes flickering with a dying light. And then he fell, the mighty Admiral Krath, scourge of the rebellion, slain at last. Galen, his breath coming in ragged gasps, turned back to the weapon's control console. The energy levels were nearing critical, the countdown to firing ticking away. With a final command, he turned the weapon's fury upon the Voxari fleet, upon the ships that had brought such terror and destruction to Zephyr Prime. The effect was devastating. The flagship's viewports flared with blinding light as the weapon discharged, a lance of pure energy ripping through the Voxari vessels like a blade through silk. Ships exploded, their hulls shattering, their crews consumed in the maelstrom of destruction. The rebel forces on the planet's surface cheered as they watched the enemy fleet burn, as they realized that victory, against all odds, was within reach. And amidst the chaos and the carnage, Galen and Mason stood side by side, bloodied but unbowed. They had struck a blow against the Voxari Empire this day, had given the rebellion on Zephyr Prime a chance to fight another day. But they both knew that this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, and there would be many more battles to come. Galen looked out at the burning wreckage of the Voxari fleet, at the rebel ships rising to meet them, and he felt a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. Perhaps, with humans and Voxari fighting together, they could find a way to end this conflict once and for all. But that was a challenge for another day. For now there was still work to be done, still a war to be won. Galen turned to Mason, a grim smile on his face. "Come on, Captain. Let's get back to the surface. I'm sure Raza and his people will want to thank us properly." Mason nodded, hefting his plasma rifle. "Lead the way, Galen, lead the way." The flight back to the human flagship was filled with a sense of triumph and relief. In the hangar bay, Galen and the strike team were greeted by cheering crowds of soldiers and crew members, their faces beaming with pride and gratitude. Admiral Sinclair himself was there to meet them, his hand outstretched in a gesture of respect and camaraderie. "Galen, Captain Mason, you've done the impossible," he said, his voice filled with awe. "The Voxari fleet is in ruins, and the rebel colony is safe. You've given us a fighting chance in this war." Raza stepped forward, his scarred face split by a wide grin. "The Voxari rebels owe you a debt we can never repay," he said, clasping Galen's hand. "From this day forward, we fight alongside you, brothers in arms against the tyranny of the Empire." As the celebration continued, Galen felt a sense of purpose and belonging that he had never known before. He had found his place, fighting for a cause he believed in, alongside allies he trusted with his life. But the moment was short-lived. A communications officer pushed through the crowd, his face pale and his eyes wide with urgency. "Galen, sir," he said, his voice trembling. "We've just received word from Zephyria. The planet has been invaded by a massive Voxari force, led by Commander Zaxxon." Galen felt his blood run cold. Zaxxon, his own brother, a fanatical loyalist to the Empire. He had always been jealous of Galen's intelligence and potential, and now he had been tasked with crushing the resistance on Zephyria and making an example of Galen's betrayal. Galen knew he had to act fast. He turned to Mason, his eyes blazing with determination. "Captain, I need your help. I have to go back to Zephyria to confront my brother and save my home." Mason nodded, his jaw set. "You've got it, Galen. I'm with you no matter what. And I know just the team to bring along." Hours later, Galen found himself back in a dropship, hurtling through space towards Zephyria. Mason was at his side, along with a hand-picked team of elite human soldiers. Among them was Jenna, a powerful psionic warrior with abilities that defied explanation. As they approached the planet, they were met by a fierce Voxari blockade, a wall of ships bristling with weapons and shields. Mason gripped the controls, his face grim. "Hold on tight, everyone. This is going to get rough." The dropship weaved and dodged through a hail of plasma fire, its hull groaning under the strain. Galen manned the turret, his exoskeleton-enhanced reflexes allowing him to pick off enemy fighters with precise bursts of energy. Somehow, through a combination of skill and sheer luck, they managed to punch through the blockade, diving towards the planet's surface. But as they entered the atmosphere, they were greeted by a scene of utter devastation. Zephyria was in chaos, its once proud cities reduced to rubble, its skies choked with smoke and ash. In the distance, they could see the flashes of weapons fire and the glow of burning buildings. As they touched down on the outskirts of the capital, they were met by a ragtag group of Voxari resistance fighters, led by a familiar face. It was Raxon, Galen's old friend and engineering mentor. "Galen, thank the stars you're here," Raxon said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Zaxxon's forces have taken control of the city. They're rounding up civilians, executing anyone who resists." Galen felt a surge of anger and determination. He turned to Mason and the others. "We have to stop them. We have to save as many people as we can." Over the next few days, Galen and his team joined forces with the resistance, engaging in a series of daring raids and sabotage missions against Zaxxon's troops. They hit supply lines, destroyed weapons caches, and freed prisoners from makeshift camps. But Zaxxon was always one step ahead, his forces seeming to anticipate their every move. It was during one of these missions that Galen finally came face to face with his brother. They were infiltrating a heavily guarded compound, trying to destroy a stockpile of chemical weapons, when a massive Voxari war machine burst through the wall, its armored hull glinting in the sunlight. And there, in the cockpit, was Zaxxon, his face twisted into a sneer of hatred and rage. "Hello, brother," he snarled, his voice amplified by the machine's speakers. "I always knew you were a traitor, but I never thought you'd stoop so low as to ally yourself with these human filth." Galen felt a rush of anger and sorrow, his heart torn between his loyalty to his brother and his hatred for what he had become. "Zaxxon, please," he pleaded. "It doesn't have to be this way. We can end this war. We can find a way to live in peace." But Zaxxon only laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Peace? With the humans? Never. They are a blight on the galaxy, a species that must be exterminated, and you, dear brother, will be the first to fall." With that, he launched himself at Galen, the war machine's massive fists swinging with bone-crushing force. Galen leapt aside, his exoskeleton whirring and clicking as he dodged and weaved. Around them, the battle raged, plasma bolts and shrapnel filling the air. Mason and the others fought with a ferocity born of desperation, taking down Voxari soldiers left and right. But Galen's focus was solely on Zaxxon, on the monster his brother had become. They clashed again and again, the war machine's armor sparking and denting under the force of Galen's blows. It was a battle of wills as much as weapons, a test of their resolve and their beliefs. And in the end, it was Galen who emerged victorious. With a final desperate lunge, he managed to find a weak spot in the war machine's armor, his exoskeleton-enhanced strength allowing him to tear through the metal like paper. Zaxxon let out a scream of rage and pain as the machine's systems failed, sparks and smoke pouring from its joints. The cockpit canopy shattered, and Zaxxon tumbled to the ground, his body broken and bleeding. Galen stood over him, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, brother," he whispered. "I'm sorry it had to end this way." But Zaxxon only glared at him, his eyes filled with a hatred that burned like a supernova. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice a ragged whisper. "The Empire will never stop, never rest until every last human is wiped from existence. And you, dear brother, will die a traitor's death." With a final shuddering breath, Zaxxon closed his eyes, his life slipping away. Galen stood over Zaxxon's broken body, his chest heaving, his exoskeleton whirring softly. Around him, the sounds of battle faded as the last of his brother's forces were routed by the human soldiers and the Zephyrian resistance. Mason approached, clapping Galen on the shoulder. "We did it, kid. Zephyria is free." But Galen shook his head. "No, not yet. There's still work to be done." With renewed purpose, Galen and his team pushed forward to the capital city, their weapons at the ready. As they neared the Grand Council chamber, they were met by a group of Voxari elders, their faces lined with age and worry. "Please," one of them said, stepping forward, "we mean you no harm. We have been secretly opposed to this war from the beginning." Galen lowered his pulse rifle, surprise etched on his face. Then why didn't you stop it? The elder sighed. Because the true power behind the Voxari Empire is not the military or the government. It is the Syndicate. He went on to explain how the Syndicate, a cabal of industrialists and arms dealers, had been manipulating the Voxari for generations, using fear and propaganda to keep them in a constant state of war and conflict. Galen's hands clenched into fists, his rage boiling over. They have to be stopped. The elders nodded. And we will help you do it. Over the next few days, Galen and his team worked with the elders and the resistance to hatch a plan. They would infiltrate the Syndicate's headquarters on Vulcanus, a heavily guarded industrial world, and bring them to justice. To get past the Syndicate's security, they enlisted the help of a group of Voxari hackers and smugglers, who provided them with disguises and false identities. As they approached Vulcanus in a stolen cargo ship, Galen felt a sense of trepidation. He knew they were walking into the heart of the enemy's power. The ship touched down on a landing pad, and Galen and his team disembarked, their disguises in place. They made their way into the Syndicate's towering headquarters, a monolith of steel and glass. Once inside, they split up. Mason and Jenna headed for the enforcement wing, while Galen and Raxon made for the main data vault. As Galen and Raxon crept through the corridors, the sound of gunfire and shouting echoed from elsewhere in the building. Mason and Jenna had engaged the Syndicate's enforcers. They reached the vault, and Raxon set to work hacking the lock. Galen stood guard, his pulse rifle at the ready. With a hiss, the vault door slid open, revealing rows upon rows of databanks. Galen and Raxon hurried inside, plugging in data drives and downloading troves of incriminating files. Suddenly, an alarm blared, and the vault door slammed shut behind them. They were trapped. A holographic figure flickered to life before them, a ruthless-looking Voxari with cybernetic enhancements. "Galen," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "I am Zarn, leader of the Syndicate, and you have something that belongs to me." Galen's grip tightened on his rifle. "The only thing that belongs to you is a prison cell, Zarn." Zarn laughed, a cold, metallic sound. "Oh, Galen, you have no idea of the power you are dealing with. Join me and I can give you anything you desire. Wealth, power, control over the Voxari Empire." Galen's jaw clenched. "I will never betray my principles or my friends." "Then you will die." The hologram vanished, and the room began to fill with a noxious gas. Galen and Raxon held their breath, their eyes watering. With a burst of sparks, Raxon managed to override the lockdown, and they stumbled out into the corridor, gasping for air. But their escape was cut short by the arrival of Zarn himself, his body a nightmarish fusion of flesh and metal. "You should have taken my offer, Galen," he growled, his cybernetic arm transforming into a crackling energy blade. Galen readied himself, his exoskeleton humming with power. "I'll never stop fighting for what's right." They clashed in a furious duel, Galen's exoskeleton-enhanced strength pitted against Zarn's cybernetic might. The corridor filled with the sound of metal on metal, sparks flying as their blades met again and again. Galen could feel his exoskeleton starting to fail, its power cells drained by the prolonged combat. But he pushed on, fueled by sheer determination. In a final, desperate lunge, Galen managed to pierce Zarn's defenses, his blade slicing through the cyborg's chest. Zarn staggered, his cybernetic systems failing. Galen stood over him, breathing hard. "It's over, Zarn. The Syndicate is finished." But Zarn only laughed, a gurgling, blood-filled sound. "You think this is the end? The Syndicate is just one head of the Hydra. Cut it off, and two more will take its place." With a final, shuddering breath, Zarn slumped to the floor, dead. Galen and Raxon made their way back to the landing pad, where Mason and Jenna were waiting, battered but alive. As they lifted off from Vulcanus, Galen stared out at the stars, his mind whirling with the implications of Zarn's final words. As the news of the Syndicate's downfall spread across the galaxy, the Voxari Empire fractured into warring factions, each vying for power in the sudden vacuum. On Zephyria, however, the mood was one of jubilation and relief. Galen and his team were welcomed as liberators, their names chanted in the streets by the newly freed Voxari people. In the Grand Council chamber, the elders gathered to form a new government, the Voxari Republic. They pledged to build a society based on truth, transparency, and cooperation with the other races of the galaxy. Galen stood among them, his exoskeleton gleaming in the chamber's lights. Despite his injuries, he felt a sense of pride and purpose. He had helped to free his people from the tyranny of the Syndicate, and now they had a chance to forge a new path. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. Galen's comm unit crackled to life, and the grim visage of Admiral Sinclair appeared in holographic form. "Galen, we need you," Sinclair said, his voice urgent. "The fleet's been ambushed by a Voxari force unlike anything we've seen before. They're being led by a warlord named Xaver, and they're tearing us apart." Galen's blood ran cold. He had heard whispers of Xaver during his time with the Syndicate, a ruthless warrior, fanatically loyal to the old ways of the Empire. If he had a fleet at his command, the humans were in grave danger. "I'm on my way, Admiral," Galen said, already moving towards the door. "My team will be with me. We'll do whatever it takes to stop Xaver." He gathered his companions, Mason, Jenna, Raxon, and the others, and they boarded their ship, rocketing into the stars towards the coordinates Sinclair had provided. What they found was a scene of utter carnage. The wreckage of human ships drifted in the void, their hulls scorched and shattered. Among them prowled Xaver's fleet, their ships a nightmarish fusion of organic and mechanical components. At the center of the maelstrom was Xaver's flagship, a monstrous vessel bristling with weapons. Galen steered their ship towards it, his jaw set with resolve. "We're going in," he said, his voice steady. "We have to end this now." They docked with the flagship, and the moment the airlock opened, they were swarmed by Xavor's warriors, Voxari zealots, their bodies augmented with cybernetic enhancements. Galen and his team fought through them, their weapons flashing, their exoskeletons whirring with power. Deck by deck, they battled their way to the bridge, leaving a trail of broken bodies in their wake. And there, standing among his elite guard, was Xavor himself. He was a towering figure, his body more machine than flesh. His eyes glowed with a malevolent red light, and his voice was a metallic rasp. "You're too late, Galen," he sneered. "The bombs are already in place. In a matter of hours, your precious human worlds will be nothing but dust." Galen's grip tightened on his rifle. "We'll stop you, Xaver. We'll find a way." Xavor laughed, a grating, mechanical sound. "You can try." He gestured to his guards, and they surged forward, their weapons blazing. Galen and his team met them head-on, and the bridge dissolved into a chaos of flashing blades and searing plasma. Galen fought his way to Xavor, his exoskeleton straining with each blow. The warlord was immensely strong, his cybernetic limbs able to crush steel. But Galen was fueled by a righteous fury, a determination to end Xavor's reign of terror. With a final, desperate lunge, he drove his plasma blade into Xavor's chest, piercing his armor and finding the vital organs beneath. Xavor staggered, his systems failing. Galen stood over him, breathing hard. "It's over, Xaver. Your fleet is in ruins, and your bombs will never reach their targets." Xaver glared up at him, hatred burning in his mechanical eyes. "You think this is the end? There will always be those who oppose you, Galen. You and your precious alliance." With a final, shuddering breath, Xavor slumped to the deck, his cybernetic body sparking and twitching. Galen turned to his team, his face grim. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. There would be others like Xavor, other threats to the fragile peace they had fought so hard to achieve. But for now, they had a mission. They had to find those bombs, had to save the human worlds from annihilation. Galen moved to the flagship's control console, his fingers dancing over the keys. He had to find a way, had to stop the destruction before it was too late. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and failure was not an option. Galen's fingers flew across the flagship's control console, his eyes scanning the readouts with a frantic intensity. The locations of Xaver's graviton bombs flashed on the screen, each one a deadly promise of destruction. "We have to disarm those bombs," Galen said, his voice tight with urgency. "If even one of them detonates, it could cripple the human colonies for generations." Mason nodded grimly. "Then let's get to work." They split into teams, each one racing to a different bomb site. Galen, Mason, and Jenna boarded a small, fast fighter craft, the engines roaring to life as they blasted out of the hangar bay. The first few bombs were relatively easy to disarm, their security systems no match for Galen's hacking skills and Mason's steady hands. But as they approached the final site, a remote human mining colony, their hearts sank. The colony was under attack, its defenses crumbling under the onslaught of a heavily armed group of Voxari insurgents. The loyalists to Xavor were making a final, desperate attempt to detonate the bomb and strike a blow against the humans. Galen brought the fighter in low, skimming over the battle-scarred landscape. Plasma bolts flashed past the cockpit, the insurgents' anti-aircraft guns trying to knock them out of the sky. "Hold on!" Galen yelled, wrenching the controls hard to the left. The fighter spun and dove, narrowly avoiding a barrage of incoming fire. They landed hard, the fighter skidding to a stop in a spray of dirt and debris. Galen, Mason, and Jenna leapt out, their weapons already firing. The colony's security personnel rallied around them, the ragtag group of miners and engineers taking up arms to defend their home. Together, they pushed back against the insurgents, the air thick with the stench of ozone and burned metal. Galen's exoskeleton whirred and clicked as he moved, its enhanced strength and speed allowing him to plow through the enemy lines like a juggernaut. His plasma rifle spat blue fire, each shot finding its mark with deadly accuracy. But the insurgents were well-trained and fanatical, their loyalty to Xaver bordering on the religious. They fought with a savage ferocity, heedless of their own safety. Galen knew they were running out of time. The bomb was close. He could feel it. With a final burst of speed, he broke through the last line of defense, leaving Mason and Jenna to deal with the remaining insurgents. He sprinted into the mining complex, his suit's sensors scanning for the bomb's energy signature. He found it in the central chamber, a pulsing, glowing sphere of destruction. Galen skidded to a halt, his hands already moving to disarm the device. But as he worked, a shadow detached itself from the wall behind him. It was Zix, the insurgent leader, his eyes blazing with hate. In each hand, he held a crackling plasma sword, the blades humming with deadly energy. "You think you've won, traitor?" Zix snarled, his voice thick with contempt. "You think you can stop the inevitable?" Galen straightened, his own plasma blade igniting in a blaze of blue fire. "I can try." They came together in a clash of blades, the plasma sparking and spitting as they dueled. Zix was fast, his swords weaving a deadly pattern through the air. But Galen was faster, his exoskeleton enhancing his every move. They danced through the chamber, their blades flashing and whirling. Galen could feel his suit's power levels dropping, the constant strain of battle taking its toll. But he pushed on, his jaw clenched with determination. Zix pressed the attack, his blades hammering at Galen's defenses. Galen's parries became slower, his counters less precise. It seemed that the insurgent leader might overwhelm him through sheer, relentless fury. But Galen had one final trick up his sleeve. As Zix lunged in for a killing blow, Galen twisted to the side, his blade slicing out in a blinding arc. There was a flash of plasma, a howl of pain, and Zix staggered back, his sword arm severed at the elbow. The insurgent leader stared at the smoking stump in shock, his remaining blade falling from nerveless fingers. Galen didn't hesitate. He leapt forward, his blade stabbing out in a final swift strike. The plasma sword pierced Zix's chest, the smell of seared flesh filling the air. Zix crumpled, his life fading from his eyes. Galen stood over him, breathing hard, his suit's cooling systems whirring to dissipate the heat of battle. But there was no time to rest. The bomb still pulsed behind him, its timer ticking down with merciless precision. Galen turned, his fingers flying over the device's control panel. It was close, so close. The timer read 5 seconds, then 4, then 3. Galen's heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. 2 seconds, 1. With a final desperate lunge, Galen's hand closed on the last wire. He yanked it free, the timer freezing at the very last instant. The bomb lay dead and inert, its destructive power forever neutralized. Galen sagged back, his legs suddenly weak. He had done it. Against all odds, he had saved the colony. As the blinding light from the exploding artifact faded, Galen lowered his arm from his eyes. The eerie blue glow had vanished, replaced by the dull, rusty hues of Zaltor's makeshift laboratory. Galen's exoskeleton whirred as he rushed to his former mentor's side. Zaltor lay on the ground, a smoking hole in his chest where Galen's plasma bolt had struck him. His eyes were wide and glassy, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You fool!" Zaltor wheezed, his voice thick with pain and bitterness. "You've doomed us all! That artifact was our only hope!" Galen shook his head, his heart heavy with sorrow and regret. "No, Zaltor. That artifact was a weapon of destruction, nothing more. It would have consumed you, just as it consumed the Voxari long ago." Zaltor's lips twisted into a sneer. "You know nothing of our history, boy. The humans have poisoned your mind with their lies." Galen stood, his exoskeleton clicking as he moved. "I know enough. I know that the path of violence and revenge will only lead to more suffering. We have to find another way." He turned to leave, but Zaltor's voice stopped him. "You think you've won, Galen? You think this is over? There are others out there, others who share my vision. They will finish what I started." Galen looked back at his former mentor, his eyes filled with sadness. "Then I'll stop them too, as many times as it takes." He walked out of the laboratory, leaving Zaltor to his bitter, broken dreams. The journey back to the human fleet was a long one, giving Galen plenty of time to reflect on all that had happened. The war had changed him, in ways he was only beginning to understand. He had seen the best and worst of both his people and the humans, had watched as old hatreds and new alliances shaped the fate of the galaxy. When he finally arrived at the fleet, he was greeted by a sea of cheering faces. Soldiers and crew members alike crowded around him, clapping him on the back and shouting their congratulations. Admiral Sinclair was there too, his face beaming with pride. "Well done, Galen," he said, shaking Galen's hand firmly. "You've saved countless lives today. The human race owes you a debt we can never repay." Galen nodded, feeling a rush of emotion he couldn't quite name. "Thank you, Admiral. But the real heroes are the ones who didn't make it back. The ones who gave their lives to stop Zavor and his bombs." Sinclair's face grew somber. "Indeed, we will honor their sacrifice and make sure that their deaths were not in vain." He paused, as if considering his next words carefully. "Galen, I have an offer for you. A position in our military as a special operative. Your skills and knowledge would be invaluable to us." Galen was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. A part of him was tempted by the offer, by the chance to continue fighting alongside his human allies. But another part, a deeper part, knew that his place was elsewhere. "I'm honored, Admiral," he said at last, "but I'm afraid I must decline. My people need me now more than ever. We have a long road ahead of us, and I intend to walk it with them." Sinclair nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. "Of course. I respect your decision, Galen, but know that you will always have a place among us, should you ever change your mind." Galen thanked the Admiral once more, then turned to make his way back to his ship. He had a long journey ahead of him, back to Zephyria and the shattered remnants of Voxari society. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that his work was far from over. Zaltor's words echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. He was just boarding his ship when his communicator buzzed, the sound harsh and urgent in the silence of the hangar bay. Galen frowned, wondering who could be contacting him now, after all that had happened. He activated the device and a holographic figure flickered to life before him. It was Zaltor, his face gaunt and haggard, his eyes wild with a feverish light. "Galen," the old Voxari rasped, his voice thin and strained. "If you're seeing this, then I am already dead, and the artifact has been destroyed." Galen's heart skipped a beat, his mind reeling with the implications of Zaltor's words. How could this be possible? "But there is still hope," Zaltor continued, his image flickering and distorting. "The artifact was just one piece of a larger puzzle, a trail of clues left behind by our ancestors. If you can find the other pieces, if you can unravel the secrets they hold, then you may yet be able to save our people." The hologram faded, leaving Galen alone in the hangar bay, his mind spinning with questions and doubts. He knew that he should report this to Admiral Sinclair, to the human leadership. But something held him back, a nagging feeling that this was a path he had to walk alone. He made his decision in an instant, his fingers flying over the ship's controls as he plotted a new course. He would follow Zaltor's trail wherever it led him. He would find the truth behind the Voxari's ancient past and the key to their future. As the ship lifted off from the hangar bay, Galen felt a sense of purpose settle over him, a clarity of focus he had never known before. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, what dangers he would face, but he knew that he would face them head-on, with all the strength and courage he possessed. For he was Galen, the last hope of the Voxari, and the fate of the galaxy rested on his shoulders. Galen's breath came in ragged gasps, each intake of air sending bolts of pain through his battered body. Blood pooled beneath him, a crimson stain spreading across the cold metal floor. His vision swam, the edges of his sight blurring into darkness. In that moment, as he teetered on the brink of oblivion, a vision flashed before his eyes. He saw his father, the proud Voxari general, standing tall and resolute. The same general who had given his life to save his son, who had sacrificed everything for a chance at peace. "You must fight on, Galen," his father's voice echoed in his mind, "no matter the cost." With a surge of strength born of sheer willpower, Galen pushed himself to his feet. His exoskeleton sparked and smoked, the damage from the Maestro's assault evident in every whirring joint and flickering light. But Galen paid it no mind. His focus was solely on the Maestro, on ending the Shadowhand's reign of terror once and for all. He charged, a roar of fury tearing from his throat. The Maestro, caught off guard by Galen's sudden resurgence, barely had time to react before Galen slammed into him, sending them both crashing to the ground. They grappled on the floor, a tangle of limbs and armored plates. Galen rained blows down on the Maestro, his fists pounding against the man's face and chest with savage ferocity. The Maestro fought back, his cybernetic enhancements giving him inhuman strength. He lashed out with a kick that sent Galen flying, his body smashing into a nearby console in a shower of sparks. But Galen was relentless. He surged forward again, ducking under the Maestro's swinging fists and driving his shoulder into the man's gut. They crashed into a wall, the metal buckling under the impact. Galen's hands found the Maestro's cybernetic implants, his fingers digging into the metal and circuitry. With a howl of rage, he tore them free, ripping them from the Maestro's body in a spray of blood and sparks. The Maestro screamed, his body convulsing as his enhancements were forcibly removed. He collapsed to the ground, his limbs twitching, his eyes rolling back in his head. Galen staggered to the nearby console, his vision blurring, his head pounding. His fingers shook as he typed in the override codes, his blood smearing the keys. But it was too late. Even as the explosions across the galaxy were halted, the damage had been done. The Voxari Republic, already weakened by the war, splintered into factions, each vying for control in a brutal civil war. The Human Alliance, rocked by the revelations of the Shadowhand's influence, turned inward, leaders and politicians scrambling to root out the traitors in their midst. Galen watched it all unfold, his heart heavy with the weight of what had been lost. The sacrifices made, the lives ended, all in the pursuit of a peace that now seemed further away than ever. As his consciousness faded, Galen's thoughts drifted to those he had fought alongside, those he had called friends, to the countless innocents caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. The galaxy would rebuild in time. The Voxari and the humans would have to find a way to coexist, to forge a path forward free of the puppeteers who had sought to control them. But that way forward would be hard-fought and blood-soaked. The scars of the conflict would linger for generations. As Galen slipped into the waiting embrace of unconsciousness, he could only hope that the sacrifices made had not been in vain, that someday the galaxy would know true peace, built on the foundation of those who had given everything to achieve it.
If you finish this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.